All the Young Dudes. Sirius's Perspective by Rollercoaster Words. Chapter 88. 5th Year, Stalemate. Tuesday, the 16th of March, 1976. Sirius Black was a coward. He was the biggest, stupidest, rottenest coward that had ever graced the halls of Gryffindor Tower. He was almost entirely certain that if someone put the sorting hat on his head now, it would determine, for the first time in its long history, that it had made a mistake in placing him here. He wasn't courageous, and he certainly wasn't brave. He just wanted to hide. Seeing Remus had become a new and unique form of torture. Sirius could tell the boy wanted to talk to him. He tried to catch his eye or hang back in the dorm after class, with a subtle, imploring look on his face. But the thought of being alone with Remus, even for a moment, was enough to make his stomach clench, to make his palms sweat and his heart pound as heat crawled up the back of his neck, and he remembered the feeling of Remus's lips. No, being alone would be a very, very bad idea. Even if he managed to string 2 words together, Sirius hadn't got a clue what he would say. He was ridiculously grateful that Moony didn't seem inclined to tell anyone about what had happened, but it was clear that he wanted an explanation, and Sirius had none to give. He wasn't even entirely sure how to explain to himself what had happened. The only thing Sirius was certain of, that whatever it was, it had been his fault. "You are tainted." He felt an overwhelming swell of guilt whenever he thought about it, which happened to be quite often, no matter how hard he tried to push the memory to the back of his mind. Even with Mary, Sirius found his mind wandering. She'd wrap her arms languidly around his neck, and he'd remember how Remus had gripped there, urgently, with calloused fingers. Or he'd catch a whiff of her fruity perfume as he kissed her, and remember Remus's scent, warm and burning sweet, fire whiskey and birthday cake. He hated himself for it. Hated himself for continuing to kiss her, for growing hot and eager. He hated himself for pinning her wrists down, for stopping her from touching him, for using his hands and his mouth as penance, doing all the things he knew that she liked, until there was nothing but her skin, her sharp, panting breaths, the noises she made. He hated that it was never enough, that she could smile up at him, and not know that when he slept at night he was dreaming of someone else. Mary deserved better. Sirius knew that. She was so vibrant, so bright, she was the sun, the centre of her own solar system. She deserved adoration, devotion, someone who could faithfully, gratefully orbit, who would fully appreciate her warmth and light. But Sirius didn't want the sun. At night, he dreamt of the moon. If he was brave, he might have tried to explain that to her. If he had an ounce of courage, he would confess and give her the honesty that she deserved. If he wasn't so selfish, he would let her go, instead of dragging her down into his own downward spiral. But Sirius Black was a coward. And sometimes Mary felt like the only thing standing between him and a precipice, a sharp incline that he knew he would never return from if he let himself fall. The problem was that he still liked Mary. It wasn't as if he didn't have fun snogging her. It wasn't as if she'd suddenly stopped being beautiful and funny and kind. She was everything he ever could have wanted. And he did want her. Mostly. But not the way he wanted. Well, there were lots of things he wanted, many of which he would never have. There was no point dwelling on it. Better to shove it all down, lock it away, bottle it up. It was what he'd always done, and there was no reason to stop now. Besides, Sirius was sure that if he just gave it enough time, these urges would go away. It wasn't as if they were normal. No one else seemed to have them. Mary was normal. Mary was right. If he just stayed with Mary and pushed everything else away, then eventually it would all be okay. Eventually he'd be able to look Remus in the eye again. As it was, though, Sirius spent the week after Remus's birthday avoiding the boy as much as possible. There was one close call, after Charms class, when James hung back to chat with Flitwick, and Peter hurried off to the loo. The other 2 marauders were left behind, but the corridor was busy. Sirius thought he was safe. "Look, about the other night," Remus began to speak, and panic seized him. Sirius cut him off before he could finish, blustering, Yeah, we're all so pissed, right?" He forced a laugh. People were staring. Merlin people were looking. Mental. Can hardly remember half of it. Please, he thought desperately, incoherently. Please, please, please. Yeah, right. Remus frowned, and something shuttered in his eyes, but he didn't bring it up again. Sirius felt sick with relief, and gratitude, and guilt. It was such an obvious lie, and he knew that Remus knew, and that Remus knew that he knew. The shared knowledge that sat between them, the line that Sirius couldn't force himself to cross. By the time the full moon came around, Sirius felt stretched thin, like he'd been dancing on the edge of a knife. It was so difficult, trying to smother your own mind. James's mum had been right. He wore his heart on his sleeve, and he didn't know how to cover it. He had already transformed into a dog when they entered the shack. Feelings were easier as a dog, everything was. Sometimes Sirius wished that he didn't have to change back. He wondered how long he could stay as Padfoot. Ages, he bet. Not that he'd ever have to find out. James was the only one still human, and he greeted Remus as they walked in. "Evening, Moony." Padfoot watched as James poked his head through the door. "It's starting," came Remus's voice. Padfoot already knew. He could smell the blood moving, the sharp canine scent. "Hurry up, get in." James transformed immediately, and the stag, the dog, and the rat stood vigil as their friend began to scream. Once the brutal transformation was over, it was an easy moon. The wolf didn't know about the kiss, or if he did, he didn't care. There was nothing to separate them as they ran, and hunted, and howled at the moon. They were what they had always been, friends. More than that, pack. Of course, the second Sirius was human again, all the messy feelings came rushing in. He averted his eyes as Remus covered himself with a blanket. Disgusted with himself, and already missing the easy camaraderie that came when they were animals. Sirius ducked under the cloak the moment James pulled it out, feeling awash as relief as they returned to Hogwarts without their friend. Even though he didn't have any new injuries, Pomfrey would probably keep Remus in the hospital wing for at least a few hours to recuperate from the trauma of the transformation. Maybe even overnight if Sirius got lucky. He froze. "Oi!" James hissed, as the cloak nearly tugged from their shoulders by Sirius's sudden halt. "What are you playing at, Black?" Sorry, he muttered, and quickly began moving again. James gave him a funny look, but refrained from questioning. They couldn't make any noise as they were creeping around under the invisibility cloak, unless they wanted to get caught. The boys made it back to their dorm and flopped down onto their respective beds, hoping to catch a few minutes of sleep before they had to leave for classes. But Sirius stayed awake, staring blankly at the wooden grain of the bed frame, with a hollow feeling in his chest. What was he thinking? Hoping that his best friend had been damaged enough by the torture of his werewolf transformation that he would have to spend the night in a hospital wing, just so that he could have a few extra hours of space. Every time Sirius thought he couldn't get any more selfish, he surprised himself. Things couldn't go on like this, he decided. He couldn't succumb to his own weakness, not if it meant sacrificing his friendship with Remus. Even if Moony was going to get angry with him for what had happened in the stairwell, he would have done it by now. If he was going to tell someone else, he would have done it by now. If he was going to decide to stop being friends with Sirius, he would have done that by now. None of the worst-case scenarios had happened. If anything, Remus didn't seem to really be all that affected by the kiss. He had been entirely calm and casual in their interactions since. Which was fine. Good, even. Didn't mean anything. So it shouldn't have any effect. Sirius was just tainted. He swallowed. He would go to the hospital wing that afternoon, he decided. He couldn't keep avoiding Moony forever. At some point, he would have to address what had happened, assure Remus that nothing had changed, so they could both move on. It had been a mistake, whatever it was, an accident, no big deal. When he arrived at the hospital wing at 3:45, Remus was still sleeping. Madame Pomfrey warned Sirius sternly not to wake her patient, but allowed him to pull up a chair next to his bed. Sirius kept his eyes glued to the floor. He felt strange, watching Moony sleep. He didn't want to stare at the soft rise and fall of his chest, the long fingers that twitched as he dreamed, the unclenched line of his jaw, the scar crossing the bridge of his nose, his mouth. Fortunately, he didn't have to wait long. Sirius had been seated for a few minutes when Remus began to stir, eyelids fluttering open. When he saw Sirius sitting there, His eyes widened slightly in unguarded surprise. "Morning," Sirius mumbled, smiling self-consciously. "Morning," Remus said back, sitting up. "Good night, was it?" "Yeah, great." Sirius nodded, clinging eagerly to the topic, grateful for something safe to talk about. "Can't believe we found that waterfall. Prongs reckons it's got a cave behind it. I told him if there is, then a troll probably lives there." "They like caves, don't they?" "They do, yeah." Remus was staring at him, with a curious smile. Their eyes met. Sirius looked away. "Say something," he told himself. "Just say something." He knew he'd have to, eventually. "We're, okay, aren't we, Moony?" he heard himself ask. He didn't know how else to say it. "Course," Remus responded immediately. "Because you, James and Pete, you're my best mates." Yeah, you're my best mate. You all are." Sirius felt a crushing wave of relief. Moony wasn't looking at him like he was angry, or disgusted, or betrayed. He looked earnest, like he wanted Sirius to know that he really meant it, that nothing had changed. "Okay, good," Sirius exhaled. "Nothing has changed." He caught sight of the clock over Moony's shoulder, and frowned. There's Mary, just now, too." "Mary," Remus echoed. "Yeah, I said I'd go meet her. Pete'll be along in a bit." "No, it's fine. Once Madame Pomfrey's back, she'll probably let me out. So I'll see you this evening, yeah?" "Of course, yeah," Sirius relaxed, smiling. Remus didn't hate him. Remus still wanted to be friends. Best mates. He stood, turning to leave. "I'll see you at dinner, mate." Wednesday, the 14th of April, 1976. Sirius woke to a shriek. He startled, leaping to his feet. James grabbed his arm and shook his head, finger pressing to his lips. They both turned to look at the door. There were voices coming from below. "Rat! Horrible things! Sorry, dear, I wish we could find a nicer place for you." "Oh, it's fine. See you in the morning." Sirius sighed and leaned back against the wall. Peter. Sure enough, a large rat scurried into the room, transforming into a very sheepish-looking boy. The three of them waited, listening to the sound of footsteps, a door shutting, a few more minutes of silence, then Remus's voice. "Pete? Was that you?" "Sorry, Moony," Peter said, heading downstairs. James and Sirius followed, still blinking sleep from their eyes. "I was supposed to be keeping guard." "What are you two doing here?" Remus frowned as he saw them. "What about the match?" "We've been sleeping since the final bell," James yawned. "Then we'll be able to get another hour or two's kip in the morning. And lunchtime, if we can swing it." "You're mental," Remus smiled fondly, shaking his head. "Both of you." He glanced at Sirius, catching his eye. "Anything for our Moony," Sirius said. He held his gaze until a shiver of heat began to crawl up his spine. Then he looked away. Things were better now, more normal, but staring at Remus still felt like playing with fire, like moving his fingers closer and closer to a flame, seeing how long he could hold out before they started to burn. "We're early," Peter observed, sitting down on Remus's cot. "Aren't we, Remus?" "Yeah, I think so." He rolled his shoulders, assessing. "Yeah, I'm way off." "Oh, good. Can I go back to sleep?" Sirius didn't bother trying to hide his yawn, settling down onto the floor and leaning his head against James's shoulder. The other boy shrugged him off. "Oi, when's your appointment with McGonagall?" Sirius frowned. First thing Friday, I think." "Why?" "What are you going to say?" "Say? It's about careers, you idiot." "Oh, right." Sirius didn't try to hide another yawn. I dunno. Don't really fancy the idea of a job much. Father wanted me to go into politics, so I suppose not that." "Mum says it's a bad time to join the ministry," Peter mused. "But Desi reckons it's the best time. When the war's over, we'll be the ones on the ground floor to rebuild." "Well, that's one way of looking at it," Sirius replied, trying not to sound too sceptical. He turned to James, nudging his shoulder. Go on then. Tell us what your plans are. James raised his eyebrows innocently. Oh, come on, Potter. Don't tell me you haven't got it all laid out in front of you. Puddlemere? Holyhead? The cannons? Who's shown the most interest so far? Actually, James said loftily, as if he weren't the one who had brought it up in the first place. If you must know, they've all inquired, according to McGonagall. But I'm turning them down, for now anyway. Oh yeah? Gonna have a gap year to live off your sleek, easy millions? No, you git. I'm going to fight. Sirius blinked, processing the words. He supposed he should have known that James would say something like that. He was so unfailingly noble. You what, mate? Remus asked, brow furrowed. Well, James fiddled with his hands self-consciously. The war won't end unless people fight it. Mum and Dad are working so hard, and well, I wouldn't be any kind of son if I didn't help, would I? Dumbledore needs as many people as he can. Plus, he attempted a shaky laugh. If Wormy wants a job in the ministry, we better make sure the ministry is still standing, right? So, when you speak to McGonagall, you'll say that Quidditch can wait, that I want to do everything I can to make sure the wizarding world is safe for everyone, not just purebloods. Yeah, pretty much. He finished speaking, still staring down at his hands. Sirius thought of his family. He thought of the tattoo on Bellatrix's arm, her crazed, reverent smile as she'd spoken of the Dark Lord. He thought of Mary, shaking in his arms after Mulciper had hit her with a muffling charm, temporarily stealing her hearing. He thought of his brother, lurking behind corners and alcoves, following him around the castle when he thought that he wouldn't notice, ducking out of sight whenever Sirius tried to look him in the eye. Then that's what I'll say too. Mate, you don't have to. What else am I going to do? Retire with my uncle's inheritance and let you have all the fun? Piss off. Me too, Peter chirped eagerly. I can help. Of course you can, James said with a glowing smile. You're a marauder. It's basically the best qualification you can have. What about you, Moony? Peter asked, eyes bright, face still split in a broad grin. I'm going to... A groan of pain escaped his lips. Shit, change, quick. Sirius leapt to his feet, wondering what Moony would have said. And then he was Padfoot, and he no longer cared very much about the future. He was here, now, with his friends. And he wanted to run. Chapter 89. 5th year, the week before. Wednesday, the 21st of April, 1976. Regulus was following him again. Sirius sighed as he turned the corner, gripping his school bag. It had started after Christmas, though he wasn't exactly sure when. One day, late January, he'd realised his brother was trailing him on the way to astronomy. He'd turned round to confront him, but Reg had scurried away the moment he'd realised he'd been spotted. After that, Sirius had begun to notice it more frequently. He'd be on his way to class, or sneaking off to rendezvous with Mary, or working on a prank with James, and he'd feel that prickling sensation on the back of his neck, like someone was watching him. He didn't always catch his brother. Reg was very good at sneaking around, but he caught him often enough to know that it was always him. It had gotten so bad that he even complained to Mary about it, one evening when they thought they were alone in an empty corridor, only to hear the distinctive sound of scuffling footsteps around the corner. Bloody little creep, Sirius had snarled, when he dashed over to see a dark flash of robes disappearing down the stairwell. He's been following you? Mary asked, trotting over to stand next to him. Sirius nodded, and she leaned her head against his arm. My baby sister used to do that, she sighed wistfully. The first year I left for Hogwarts. She was too little to understand why I was gone, so when I came home for the summer she followed me around the house, scared I'd disappear again. Sirius frowned. Regulus isn't a baby. Doesn't mean he doesn't miss you. When she saw the look on his face, Mary shrugged. You miss him too. Sirius stared at her. You think he's a hateful git. She laughed, but it was a sort of sad sound. Yeah, she agreed, but I know what it's like to miss your siblings. The words stuck with him, burrowing. When he talked to James about it, the boy'd agree wholeheartedly that Regulus was being a spiteful little creep. He didn't have a shred of sympathy left for anyone in Sirius's family, after what had happened over Christmas. This had vindicated Sirius's own frustration with the situation, and made it easier to ignore the guilt struggling just beneath the surface of his anger. But Mary's words had dislodged it. After that, he couldn't stop thinking about his conversation with Dumbledore on Christmas Day, how the headmaster had said there wasn't anything they could do to get Regulus out, not unless he was in danger, or he wanted to leave. Every time Sirius noticed his brother trailing him in the halls, it was another painful reminder that he had abandoned Reg. Again. By the end of April, Sirius had had enough. He was on his way to the astronomy tower to meet with James for a prank involving the telescopes and a mild confunding charm, intended to rearrange the constellations anyone saw through the lens so that they made slightly more interesting pictures. But he couldn't exactly work in peace if his kid brother was hiding just around the corner. Sirius began a series of evasive manoeuvres on the 7th floor, walking briskly up and down the corridors, making sharp turns and double-backing, ducking in and out of classrooms, hoping Regulus would just give up the chase and bugger off back to his own dorm. He didn't. Sirius was beginning to get properly fed up. At this rate he would miss his meeting with James, and he'd gotten so muddled by his detours that he wasn't even entirely sure where he was anymore. Fortunately, he had just doubled back down a hallway, and noticed a narrow-looking passageway with a door tucked in the end of it. It was unfamiliar, which was unusual. After cataloguing the castle for their map, the Marauders knew Hogwarts better than anyone. But Sirius hadn't personally drawn up the entire thing, and there were always bound to be a few spots he didn't remember. Besides, he needed to catch Regulus, to put a stop to whatever this was, once and for all. He ducked through the door, shutting it quickly behind him. Instead of continuing to run, he waited. Sure enough, a few moments later, the door cracked open, and his brother's head poked curiously inside. Sirius grabbed him, yanking him by the robes and dragging him into the room. "Sirius, what?" Reg spluttered, stumbling, and Sirius slammed the door shut, pressing his back into it. There were no other exits. It was the only way out. The inside of the room was no more familiar than the outside. It looked to be some sort of lounge, or perhaps an old teacher's office. It was small, cosy, with a fireplace that had merry, crackling flames, and a plush armchair surrounded by a stack of books. There was a round table near the centre, which held only a chess set, flanked by 2 wooden chairs. The windows looked out on the setting sun, which was odd. Sirius could have sworn that they were on the east side of the building. "All right," he said, folding his arms. "Spit it out." Reggie blinked. "That's my chess set," he said distantly. "The one Mum got me for my 8th birthday." Sirius snorted. He knew the one that Reg was on about, and it did look incredibly similar. The same colourful, delicately painted porcelain figures. But it was impossible. Their mother had smashed that chess set in a fit of rage 3 months after buying it, when Reggie was unable to stop crying over a dead bird he'd found in the garden. "Reg," Sirius said, trying to get his brother's attention, "why are you following me?" Regulus turned, a strange expression on his face. He looked lost. But a moment later, the walls came up, and he scowled petulantly as he began to say, "I am not." He stopped, lips twitching. It was such an obvious lie that he didn't seem to be able to finish it. "Why are you following me?" Sirius asked again. After a moment, he added, "I'm not angry, I just want to know." Regulus continued to stare at him, lips twitching. There was a beat of silence. He turned to look back at the chess set. Sirius studied his brother. In the past, he'd been able to read Reggie like a book. He'd known every expression, every shift in posture, every tiny little movement. It was startling how unfamiliar the boy had become. He was no longer a child. The planes of his face had shifted, sharpening all the same ways that Sirius had when he hit puberty. He was taller, now. They were practically the same height, and his voice had deepened in his chest. It felt almost like looking into a mirror, and yet there was so little that Sirius truly recognised. He couldn't begin to guess the expression in his brother's eyes. "Have they hurt you?" he heard himself ask. Regulus spun around. "What? No, that's not... No. If they have, you can tell me. It's all right. I said no, Sirius. I'm fine. They stared at each other. His brother's expression was unwavering. Sirius might have believed him, except that he picked up one of the pawns off the chessboard and was fiddling with it in his fingers. I can get you out, he blurted without meaning to. Reggie's fingers froze. What? His voice was flat, devoid of emotion. Sirius repeated himself, heart pounding. I can get you out, Reg. I can. He began speaking faster, words tripping over each other as they rushed off his tongue. You could stay with me, at the Potters. They'd take you in, I know they would. You have to say that you want to leave. You can. You just have to want it. Dumbledore, I asked him after Christmas, but there was nothing he could do, not unless you were in immediate danger, and I said you weren't. He swallowed, feeling a wave of guilt. If he had just lied, then maybe... But if you went to him, if you asked him, if you told him you wanted to leave, I could go with you. I'm sure that he'd... Regulus laughed. It was a cold, ugly laugh, with a slightly unstable edge. Wobbly. Sirius fell silent. When Reg stopped laughing, he turned to him and said, in that same flat voice, Dumbledore isn't going to get me out. Sirius froze. He could, if he knew you were in danger, if you told him you wanted to leave. I didn't say he couldn't. I said he won't. Now the frustration was beginning to coil in the pit of Sirius's stomach. What's that supposed to mean? He snapped. Do you honestly think Dumbledore gives a shit about you? About me? About any of us? What kind of a question is that? A serious one? Do you think he actually sees any of us more than anything but... Reg broke off, glancing down at the pawn in his hand. He laughed again, bitterly, and when he looked back up, his eyes were bright with rage. If Dumbledore cares so bloody much, why didn't he report it? Why wasn't there ever an investigation, Sirius? Not even a fucking secretary from the ministry knocking on our door. They were using unforgivables on you for 40 minutes, and nothing happened. That's not true, Sirius said stubbornly. He got me out. You got yourself out. The fucking Potters got you out. Dumbledore was the one who sent you back there. If he's such a bleeding fucking heart, then why didn't he get you out last summer? Why did he send you back when he knew he didn't know? I didn't tell him. I told him! Reg was practically screaming. Sirius didn't think he'd ever seen his brother so angry. His eyes were incandescent, luminous with fury. He was panting, breathing in quick, sharp gasps. What? I told him, Regulus repeated, steadier this time. I went to Dumbledore, the day after we arrived at Hogwarts, when you said you weren't going to see Pomfrey. I told him. Sirius stared. He felt unmoored, like he was floating. Why? Reggie stared back at him, incredulous. Sirius, I had to drag you out of a pool of your own blood. I couldn't use magic. I had to force you to walk up the stairs with your legs. He broke off, sucking in a breath. When he spoke again, his voice was low, flat, controlled. I told Dumbledore what had happened. I told him that you couldn't go back home. I told him that he had to get you out of there because I thought that next time she might kill you. Do you know what he said? That bitter laugh again. He said, "Do you know what caused your mother to take such extreme measures?" Those were his words. Extreme measures. He didn't even ask if you were all right. Just wanted to know if it had anything to do with Voldemort. That's not... Sirius felt dizzy, off balance. He didn't know how to process what his brother was saying. Reg ploughed on. Once he realised that it was just a private family matter, he didn't care. Said the domestic misuse of magic laws was too vague. That there was nothing he could do unless you came to him directly, because there wasn't any proof. He knew that anything you heard from our parents about Voldemort would go straight back to the Potters. It was more useful to send you back home than it was to protect you. Sirius shook his head, disbelieving. What? He told you that? Reg smiled wanly. He didn't have to. You're not a strategist, Sirius. You always get so caught up in the big picture, you never consider the details. You don't think the way that he does." Sirius scoffed. "Strategist," he muttered, glancing pointedly at the table. "I've beaten you at chess. Only because I know you won't play unless you think you can win." Silence. It stretched between them, a tether, an anchor. Sirius swallowed. "I don't care if you don't trust Dumbledore," he said. "I can get you out. You can stay with me at the Potters. I'll break you out if I have to. I can—" "Break me out?" His brother's face had gone pale, a note of panic in his eyes. Sirius doubled down. "I can do it, Reg. James had this whole plan last summer. If we came at night, James has a way to sneak in. I can't explain how, but he wouldn't get caught. If we brought our brooms— No. It's really not that far to fly back to the Potters. We've looked it up. If we had a head start—" "I don't want to go." The words were hissed, venomous. The panic was gone. Everything was gone. His eyes were as cold and flat as a blood-sniffing shark. Sirius blinked. "What?" "I don't want to go." He hesitated, studying his brother's face. "Reg, if you stay, you know they'll— I don't want to go." "But why? I thought—" He didn't know how to do this. He didn't know how to talk to him any more. When was the last time they'd talked? "You really are pathetic, aren't you?" Regulus asked mildly, with about as much emotion as someone else might ask about the weather. Sirius felt as if he'd been struck. His brother huffed a sound that might have been a laugh, if there had been any humour in it. "Just because I don't enjoy seeing you tortured doesn't mean I want to run off and play house with your filthy little blood traitors. Unlike you, I have no desire to disgrace and degrade our family name. I'm not a failure." "You don't mean that?" Sirius whispered, wishing it didn't feel like a knife had been lodged in his throat. Reggie's eyes flashed. "You're despicable, Sirius. You had every opportunity and you wasted it. Threw it all away to chase some compulsive need to feel like a hero. You made your entire family into an enemy just so you could have something to fight against, because you can't accept that there's nothing inherently righteous about your stupid fucking self-destruction. You either abandon people you love, or you pull them into the crossfire, and you're too fucking selfish to even acknowledge what you're doing. So no, I don't want to go with you. I don't want to live with you. I hate you." There was a dull roaring in the back of his skull. Reg had the pawn gripped in his fist. Sirius opened his mouth. "I'm still your—" "Shut up, Sirius! Just stop it! You're not my brother. You haven't been for a very long time." "You don't mean that." Sirius forced the words past his teeth. "Reg, I can get you out. Just let me get you out. Please." His brother stared at him, white-faced in the setting sun, a muscle twitching in his jaw. "Do you know what Mum says about you?" he asked quietly. "What she's told me. She rattles on and on about it when you're not there. How depraved you are. How impure." Sirius felt sick. He didn't need to ask what his brother was talking about. He could see it in his face. "You disgust me," Reg spat, then, with a small, cruel smile. "Do you really think you're fooling anyone with your little mudblood girlfriend?" Sirius didn't know the boy in front of him. Regulus was right. They weren't brothers. They were strangers. He curled his hands into fists to stop them from shaking. "Just go away, Sirius," Regulus said. "You've already left. If you're really so desperate to do something for me, then stay away. Don't ever come back. It makes me sick to look at you." Before Sirius could respond, Reg was striding past him, moving for the door. It had just creaked open when he managed to speak. "You never answered my question." He heard Regulus pause. "What?" Sharp, flat, cold. "Why have you been following me?" Sirius said, hollowly. "I want to know why you've been following me." Another pause, then a sneering voice. "It doesn't matter. It won't happen again." Thursday, the 14th of May, 1976. Sirius tried to hide the worst of it from his friends. The fits of anger, the rage, the nightmares. He'd never thought of himself as a particularly violent person. Hot-tempered, maybe, but not vicious. That spring, though, he had to stifle the urge to hurt someone, anyone, didn't matter who. His friends noticed, of course. It was impossible to keep it all inside. He knew what they saw when they looked at him. Reckless, impulsive, eager for a fight, angry. That was fine, as long as they didn't see the depth of it. Sirius wasn't entirely sure that he himself knew how deep the hatred went. He didn't think he wanted to know. Mary helped. So did James. When he hadn't sequestered himself away in the library to study, he was becoming more of a swot than Mooney, obsessing over owls. And Quidditch. Smacking bludgers was incredibly therapeutic. Sirius's performance in practices improved remarkably near the end of April. By the time the Gryffindors vs Hufflepuff match rolled around, he was on top form. He flew at breakneck speed across the pitch, diving sharply without an ounce of fear. He didn't miss a single bludger the entire game. They won in a landslide, and he landed back on the field with the rest of the team. Mary came dashing out from the stands, flinging her arms around his neck. He kissed her enthusiastically, and a crowd of students rushed onto the field to congratulate them, cheering, surrounding him in red and gold. When Sirius broke away, he was grinning. He felt lighter than he had in weeks. The anger was still there, but it was further away, simmering where it usually blazed. It was hard to be anything but euphoric when he was engulfed in a cheering crowd, students slapping him on the back and singing his praises. James looked just as chuffed, smiling ear to ear as a couple of fourth years gushed over him. Peter was there, tugging on James's robes to get his attention, Desdemona at his side. Lily pushed through the crowd to find Marlene, and now the two girls were huddled next to Mary, who still had Sirius's arm wrapped around her shoulder. Sirius scanned the crowd for Remus. Normally he'd stand out. Literally, he was several inches taller than the average Hogwarts student. But today he was nowhere to be seen. Sirius frowned. Must still be in the hospital wing. But then he saw James waving towards the stands, grinning broadly. Sirius turned and spotted Mooney. He was making his way slowly down the rickety stairs. Sirius began to wave too, smiling so hard his face ached. And Remus paused, lifting an arm, and suddenly Remus plummeted, pitching forwards abruptly as he fell down the stairs. Sirius's heart leapt into his throat. He was moving before he realized it, shoving through the crowd. It took a few minutes to extricate himself as he reached the fringes of the mob. Sirius stood on his tiptoes to peer towards the stands, trying to see what had happened. Remus was sprawled out on the platform, with his wand drawn. At first, Sirius didn't see anyone else. Then he noticed a flash of slithering green, disappearing behind the stands. He shoved past a few remaining students with a bit more force than necessary. "Bloody hell, Mooney, you okay?" James asked, having followed Sirius out of the crowd when they saw their friend fall. He offered his arm, helping Remus straighten up. "Fine, yeah, must have tripped. Stupid long legs, eh?" Remus smiled weakly, trying to hide a wince. He was lying. Why was he lying? The girls arrived before Sirius could say anything, and immediately began to make a fuss, nattering on about deep breaths and asking where he was hurt and advising him to sit down. Remus stared as they buzzed around him, like a trio of particularly agitated bees, seeming at a loss of what to do. "Remus, you really are awfully pale," Lily fretted, staring up at him. Marlene reached out and placed a hand on his forehead, and Sirius watched as Remus shook her off, clearly annoyed. "I'm fine," he insisted. The girls continued to talk over each other, ignoring him. "All right, give him some air, for Merlin's sake," Sirius burst out, marching over and pushing them all away. He frowned, placing his hands on his hips. "You lot go to the changing rooms, or the great hall, or wherever you're supposed to be. Mooney, come on, let's go back to the castle. We'll go by the hospital wing. Proms, you take my broom back." Nobody protested. and Remus grasped his arm, standing stiffly. He stumbled as he put weight on one of his legs, and ended up leaning against Sirius, who thought about wrapping an arm around his waist to steady him, but didn't. "I'll come too," Mary offered, springing up. Sirius swallowed. Mooney's ribcage was pressed into his shoulder. He could feel the other boy's heartbeat. "No, it's fine," he smiled, but spoke firmly. "No need to make a big fuss, do we, Mooney? Come on." He pecked Mary quickly on the cheek before helping Remus the rest of the way down the stairs, where they hobbled slowly away from the Quidditch pitch and back towards the castle. Remus pulled away once they were alone, and something twisted in Sirius's chest. He hoped he hadn't made his friend uncomfortable. "We don't have to go and see Pomfrey if you think you're okay," he assured. "I just thought you might like to get away from that lot." "Yeah, cheers," Remus said, watching him. "I know you hate people worrying over you." "Yeah." They were walking side by side. Sirius had to go so slow so that Remus could keep up, even with his long legs. "Mooney, how did you actually fall? You never fall over, even after a moon." Remus looked away. "Well, I dunno. Wasn't looking where I was going." Sirius frowned, but didn't push. They made their way up the stairs to the Gryffindor Tower at snail's pace. Once they finally reached the safety of their room, Remus collapsed onto his bed, breathing hard. He was sweating slightly, cheeks flushed, clearly in pain. Sirius half wondered if he should have forced him to go to the hospital wing. "I'm just going to go for a shower, that's okay?" he asked quietly, apprehensive as if whether he should leave the boy alone. But Remus nodded, eyes sliding shut. Sirius showered quickly, relaying what had happened in his head. He was sure that he'd seen Slytherin robes. Remus's fall wasn't an accident. He just didn't understand why the other boy would keep it a secret. Unless it was Reg. When he stepped out of the bathroom, Remus was still sprawled on the bed. His eyes were closed, but Sirius couldn't tell if he was asleep. He was still breathing quickly, and there was a tiny furrow between his brows. He had his head lolled to the side, chin tucked against his shoulder, so that he was facing away from the sun. The sharp line of his jaw was illuminated, tousled curls haloed on his head. "Are you sleeping?" Sirius whispered. "Almost," Remus murmured, eyelids fluttering open slightly, so that he was peering up through his eyelashes. Sirius drew the curtains, blocking out the sun. He hovered next to the bed, unsure on whether he should leave. There was a jar of murtlap essence that hadn't been there before. He picked it up. "What's this for? Cut yourself?" "No." "Mooney, please tell me what happened," Sirius pleaded. "It obviously wasn't an accident. Don't you trust me?" "Of course I trust you," Remus frowned. Look, I don't need you going out for revenge, okay? It's stupid and it'll blow over." "Who?" Sirius asked, already knowing the answer. Anger bubbled like acid in his gut. 3 Slytherins. They tripped me. Yanked my foot through the stairs, that's all. Cowardly gits." "Which Slytherins?" He needed Remus to say it, to know. "Not Regulus." Sirius blinked. Remus continued. "Snape, obviously. Mosper and Crouch." "Sirius," his voice was stern now. "I'm fine, okay? Please don't go making it worse." "I won't," Sirius said, but the anger was still there, burning. Snape. Remus shut his eyes, sighing, and Sirius pulled back to the present. "Shall I leave you to sleep?" he asked carefully. "Yeah, cheers," Remus mumbled, already sounding half gone. "I'm knackered too," Sirius said, lingering. "After that match. Sort of jealous for you having an excuse. Almost wish I could lie down there with you, and not get up again until tomorrow." Remus's lips parted and he breathed. In muted sunlight, he looked like a painting. Sirius turned away. "Better get down to the feast, though. Can't miss James's victory speech." "Don't go near the Slytherins," Remus mumbled drowsily. "Promise." Sirius swallowed. "Promise." What else could he say?